The church bell rang once, loud enough to shake the silence of the dusty little town, and every person standing outside the old wooden chapel whispered the same thing. Poor boy. At 25 years old, Ethan Cole stood at the altar with trembling hands, staring at the woman he was being forced to marry. Margaret Whitmore was 65. Her silver hair was tucked neatly beneath a cream-colored hat. Her face carried wrinkles carved by time, but her eyes were sharp, intelligent, and strangely unreadable. And while the entire town believed Ethan's life had just ended, Margaret looked at him as though she knew something nobody else did. Before we begin this unforgettable story, take 1 second to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Stories like this remind us that life is never as simple as it first appears, and sometimes the people we fear the most are the ones who save us in the end. Ethan felt sweat running down his back as the priest spoke the vows. He barely heard the words. All he could think about was the debt. 3 months earlier, Ethan's father had died after a long illness. The small family farm collapsed under unpaid loans, and creditors circled the property like wolves. Ethan worked day and night, but it wasn't enough. The bank was preparing to seize everything his father had spent 40 years building. Then Margaret Whitmore made an offer. She was the richest woman in the county, owner of thousands of acres. Feared by nearly everyone, people called her cold-hearted. Some called her cursed, and she had offered to erase every debt if Ethan agreed to marry her for 1 year. 1 year. That was the deal. After that, he would walk away with enough money to rebuild his life. At least that was what he told himself when he signed the papers. The townspeople mocked him openly. You sold your soul. You married a grandmother for money. He'll regret it. Ethan hated every second of it, especially because part of him feared they were right. After the ceremony, Margaret leaned close and spoke softly for the first time all day. Rule number 1, she said calmly. Never enter the west wing of my house. Ethan blinked. What? You heard me. Then she walked toward the waiting carriage without another word. The Whitmore estate sat on a hill overlooking the valley like something from another world. Massive iron gates guarded the property. The mansion itself looked ancient, surrounded by towering oak trees that blocked the sunlight. The servants barely spoke. The halls echoed with silence. And the west wing remained locked. For the first few days, Ethan felt less like a husband and more like a prisoner. Margaret was polite but distant. She ate dinner quietly, spent hours inside her private study, and disappeared every evening into the forbidden west wing. Ethan's imagination tortured him. Was she hiding money, secrets, another person? At night, strange sounds echoed through the mansion. Sometimes footsteps, sometimes crying. He began sleeping poorly, but one thing confused him more than anything else. Margaret never treated him cruelly. Not once. She gave him new clothes, paid off his family debts immediately, even restored his father's farm in secret. One morning, Ethan discovered workers repairing the broken fences back home. He confronted her at breakfast. You fixed the farm. Margaret calmly stirred her tea. Yes. Why? Because it mattered to you. That doesn't answer my question. She looked at him carefully. You think I forced this marriage because I wanted romance? Ethan said nothing. Margaret smiled faintly. I needed someone trustworthy. That's it. For now. The answer frustrated him even more. Weeks passed. Slowly, Ethan noticed things others never had. Margaret donated money anonymously to struggling families. She paid medical bills for sick children. Every Christmas, food mysteriously appeared at poor homes across town. But nobody knew it came from her. The cruel monster people described didn't match the woman he lived with. Still, the West Wing haunted him. One stormy night, curiosity finally defeated him. Margaret had left for town. The servants were asleep, and Ethan found the key hanging beside her office desk. Rain hammered the windows as he walked down the dark hallway toward the forbidden wing. His heart pounded harder with every step. The door creaked open. Inside, dust floated through dim candlelight. Then Ethan froze. The room wasn't a hidden treasure chamber. It was a nursery. Old wooden toys lined the shelves. Tiny clothes sat folded neatly on a chair. And on the far wall hung dozens of paintings of a little girl with dark curls and bright eyes. Ethan heard a voice behind him. You shouldn't be here. He turned sharply. Margaret stood in the doorway. Not angry. Broken. For the first time since meeting her, Ethan saw tears in her eyes. "That was my daughter's room," she whispered. Ethan looked back at the paintings. "What happened to her?" Margaret's hands trembled slightly. 40 years ago, she disappeared. Silence filled the room. "She was 6 years old," Margaret continued. "Someone took her while I attended a charity event in the city. We searched for years. Police gave up. Everyone assumed she was dead." Ethan swallowed hard. "I'm sorry." Margaret stared at the tiny bed. "I never stopped waiting for her to come home." Suddenly, everything changed. The locked wing. The loneliness. The sadness hidden behind her cold reputation. Margaret hadn't been protecting secrets. She'd been protecting grief. That night, for the first time, Ethan and Margaret spoke honestly for hours. She told him how her husband abandoned her after their daughter vanished. How the town blamed her ambition for destroying her family. How isolation slowly turned her into a legend people feared. "And the marriage?" Ethan finally asked. Margaret looked at him quietly. "When doctors told me I didn't have much time left, I realized something terrifying." "What?" "I had nobody I could trust with my estate." Ethan frowned. "You barely knew me." "I knew your father," she replied softly. "He once saved my life during a flood when we were young. And unlike most people in this town, he was honest." Ethan felt something shift inside him. For weeks, he had viewed himself as a victim. But Margaret had been alone for decades. Completely alone. As months passed, their strange marriage transformed into something neither expected. Not romance. Not exactly. Something deeper. Understanding. Ethan began helping manage the estate. Margaret taught him business, leadership, and discipline. He helped her reconnect with the town little by little. People slowly stopped whispering when they saw them together. Then one afternoon, everything changed again. A letter arrived. Margaret turned pale the moment she read it. "What is it?" Ethan asked. Her hands shook violently. "She's alive." Ethan stared at her. "What?" Margaret handed him the letter. A woman from another state claimed to have information about Margaret's missing daughter. Within days, Ethan and Margaret traveled across the country together. The journey was tense and emotional. Margaret barely slept. She feared hope more than disappointment. Because disappointment had nearly destroyed her once already. Finally, they arrived at a small house near the coast. An older woman opened the door. And behind her stood a woman in her 40s with dark curls and familiar eyes. Margaret collapsed into tears instantly. It was her daughter. Alive. Kidnapped as a child by a desperate relative after a custody dispute nobody had known about. Raised under a different name. Lied to her entire life. The reunion shattered everyone emotionally. For hours, nobody stopped crying. Ethan quietly stepped outside, giving them space. As he sat on the porch watching the ocean waves crash against the shore, Margaret's daughter approached him later that evening. "You're Ethan." He nodded. She smiled gently. "My mother says you saved her life." Ethan looked back toward the house. "No," he said softly. "I think she saved mine." When they returned home weeks later, the town no longer viewed the marriage the same way. People saw the truth now. Not a greedy young man. Not a cruel old woman. Just two lonely people who had rescued each other from despair. Margaret changed after reuniting with her daughter. The sadness in her eyes faded. Laughter returned to the mansion halls. And for the first time in decades, the west wing windows opened again, letting sunlight inside. One evening, nearly a year after the wedding, Margaret invited Ethan to the garden. The sunset painted the sky gold as they sat together beneath the oak trees. "You fulfilled the agreement," she said quietly. "You're free now." Ethan looked at her carefully. The thought of leaving suddenly hurt more than he expected. Margaret handed him an envelope. Inside were ownership papers for his father's restored farm, and enough money to build a future. "You earned it," she said. Ethan's eyes filled with emotion. "You didn't have to do this." "Yes," she replied softly. "I did." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Margaret smiled gently. "You know what the funny thing is?" "What?" "Everyone thought this marriage ruined your life." Ethan laughed quietly. "But it gave me one instead." Margaret passed away peacefully 2 years later. Not alone. Her daughter held one hand. Ethan held the other, and in her final moments, the woman once feared by an entire town smiled with peace she hadn't known in 40 years. At her funeral, hundreds attended. Families she had secretly helped. children whose lives she had saved, workers she had protected. The truth about Margaret Whitmore finally became known. She had never been heartless, only heartbroken. Years later, Ethan often sat on the porch of his rebuilt farmhouse watching the sunset across the fields. People still asked him the same question. How could you marry someone 40 years older than you? Ethan would simply smile, because they would never fully understand. Sometimes life gives us love in unexpected forms. Sometimes the people we are taught to avoid are carrying the deepest pain. And sometimes the strangest paths lead exactly where we were meant to go. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with someone who needs to remember that appearances can be deceiving, and kindness can change a life forever.